Hello, and welcome to a topic lecture on the new January 2023 public forum debate topic from the NSDA, all about armed conflicts in West Asia. The topic wording is the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. My name is Jet Smith, and I'm the head coach of speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho. And the purpose of this video and all others on my channel is to make learning about debate more accessible to members within the community, be they students and coaches, preferably or mostly for people who are in Idaho, but if it helps people from outside of Idaho, that's great too. So for this video, we are going to cover three main things. First, we're going to analyze the resolution, which will take a lot of time because this one is very complex. And then we'll discuss some pro arguments and some con arguments. So let's talk about the resolution itself. And we're going to analyze the resolution through 5 different things: trichotomy, definitions, background, core controversy, and stakeholders. So first on trichotomy, we're asking ourselves, what type of topic is this? Is it policy, fact, or value? Policy topics are claims of action. They usually say somebody should do something. Value topics are claims of judgment. They'll say this is good or this is better than this other thing. Or factual topics, which will concern the nature of something. X is true or X is false, or X is or will be or X won't be. This topic is a policy topic because it has an actor, being the United States federal government. It says should, and it has an action, namely increasing diplomatic efforts. The weird part is that this topic is written to be like a policy debate topic. It sounds exactly like a year-long policy resolution. It's only missing the word substantially. However, in policy debate, the rules are a little bit different, and I think that makes this topic a little bit different as well. In policy debate, the pro or the AF team proves the topic true not by defending the entire topic, but by defending a specific example or plan of the resolution. So if the topic was, you should bring Coach Smith a drink, then each debate, the affirmative team would, instead of saying bringing Coach Smith a drink in general is good, using different drinks as examples, they would say, you should bring me a Dr. Pepper, or you should bring me a coffee, and the debate would be about just that one example. The other thing to note is that in policy debate, the affirmative always gets to speak first, which makes the negative responsible for responding to the version of the topic or the example of the topic presented by the affirmative. So even if you have a disadvantage against coffee that you really like, if the other team reads Dr. Pepper, you have to respond to the Dr. Pepper plan. So the reason why I bring up this context is because the topic being written in the way that it's written means that while you can't read a plan in public forum, I think that the pro team's strategy will look similar to how it would in policy debate. To prove this, imagine that you and a friend are arguing over whether or not you should buy a new car. So that's our debate topic, is you should buy a new car. If you say, yes, I should buy a new car, specifically because you found a great deal on a Ford Fiesta, and then your friend says, no, don't buy a new car because limousines are impractical, have they proven that you shouldn't buy a new car? And the answer is no, because you proved, yes, you should buy a new car through your example. And then their argument about a limousine doesn't really make sense. Yes, technically it's a new car, but just because you shouldn't buy a limousine doesn't mean that you shouldn't buy a new car overall. And so I think that the pro team is going to be able to prove the resolution true without proving all of the resolution true, and therefore the negative cannot win just by proving the resolution false in general. You might be thinking, but this is public forum, not policy debate. And you are correct. This is not policy debate. The affirmative could not read a plan. But if they choose to only read 1 or 2 contentions about very specific examples of conflicts going on, or very specific examples of types of diplomacy that we could do, those could prove the topic true without needing to defend all of the rest of the topic. So there are 2 different visions that I have for how debate on this topic could play out. In one world, the pro reads really generic arguments that prove the resolution true as a general principle, and the con responds by doing the same. The problem is this will likely get very complicated and muddled because you're discussing so many different things, so many different diplomatic tools, so many different internal armed conflicts in a very short debate round. Whereas if this was an actual policy debate topic, it could be discussed for an entire year in debates that are an hour and a half long each. Or the pro could choose to read really specific arguments about certain conflicts or types of diplomatic efforts, and then the con would need to tailor their arguments either in their case or in their rebuttal to the contentions read by the pro in order for them to make sense. So if the pro's case is all about why increasing efforts in Israel and Palestine would be good, then the con would need to make sure that their generic contention either also applies to Israel and Palestine, or they would need to change their contentions to be the downsides of diplomatic efforts in the Israel and Palestine internal armed conflict. The problem with this version of the topic is that it's likely to be way more difficult for the con, because the con will need to be prepared to answer every single pro argument, and really their case won't make much sense or matter that much if it can't be applied to the case that the pro is reading, which could give the pro an unfair advantage. The con might also, I really hope that this doesn't happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if in some national circuit debates, there's some sort of new theory argument that basically says that the first speaking team has the right to kind of set up what the debate is going to be about, and the second speaking team's job is to respond to that. So, in the same way that it would make sense for if the pro proves the resolution true by an example of how increased diplomatic efforts to end the internal armed conflict in Yemen proves the resolution true, then if the con team speaks first and they read a bunch of disadvantages to diplomatic efforts in Yemen to end the internal conflict, that the pro should have to respond to those. I don't like that argument. I don't think that it makes very much sense, but it wouldn't surprise me if people tried to overcome the seeming pro bias on this topic by reading an argument like that. So the next step of our resolutionary analysis is to look at definitions. And honestly, you're going to need to define so much in this topic. Maybe not in your case, but you must have definitions ready to go for every single one of these sets of terms. Otherwise, you run the risk of somebody misinterpreting the topic and completely skewing you out of the debate. So first of all is increase, which in general just means to make greater, but without the word substantial or substantially, an increase of 1 is an increase. An increase of 100 is also an increase, which means that the pro can be topical even if they're only proving just a slight increase, because any increase is an increase overall. Next is diplomatic efforts, which sounds like it should be a phrase with actual meaning, but there's no definition for the phrase diplomatic efforts anywhere. There's nothing that says these two words, when put together, mean this specific thing. But based off of understanding what the word diplomacy does, or diplomatic activities, which is something that is more frequently used in the literature, diplomatic efforts could be interpreted as conducting negotiations and maintaining relations between nations, or it could also be understood as activities that attempt to manage international relations. But most people and most places seem to consider diplomacy as being all about talks and negotiations. Peacefully resolve is also not a term of art. There's no specific definition for those two words put together. But if resolve means to end something and peacefully means without violence, then putting them together means solving disputes without war or violence. Internal armed conflicts is another thing we need to define. Now, note that it says internal armed conflicts, plural. So maybe that means that an increase of 1, or diplomatic efforts to end 1 internal conflict isn't enough to prove the resolution true. Maybe the pro has to prove at least 2 to end multiple internal armed conflicts. But these are often called in the literature non-international armed conflicts, or NIACs, NIACs. And in order to meet the definition of an internal armed conflict, you have to have these 3 things. 1, it has to have violence involving armed confrontations. 2, those need to be between government forces and 1 or more organized armed groups. So not between 2 government forces, that's international. Internal means one side is the government, and then 1 or more of the other sides is just organized armed groups that are not from a specific alternate country outside of the territory. And then lastly is third, it needs to take place within the territory of the state to which the government forces belong. So if the United States was fighting a war against a group outside of America that was not a country, that would not be an internal armed conflict in America. Lastly, we have West Asia, for which there is also no universally agreed upon definition, and there are lots of countries that different people have considered to be part of this. I'm not going to name all of them, but each of those countries could be considered to be part of West Asia by at least one source. So some of them are more controversial than others as far as whether or not they're included, but most places would agree that there's at least 18 countries in West Asia. Um, to continue to talk about definitions, because all of these different complex things have to be put together, the first part of the resolution being the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve, in English basically means the United States should attempt to engage in more negotiations that manage international relations in order to solve disputes without war or violence. So from the US Department of State, they have a whole bunch of different terms that they include as part of diplomacy, that I think you could call these different things diplomatic efforts. So when people ask you, well, what diplomatic efforts would be increased, or what does it mean to increase diplomatic efforts, these 12 things could be things that we do more of. And I'm not going to say all of them. I also put the link to the State Department's website where I got them, because the U.S. Department of State is the branch, or the part of the executive branch that engages in most of our diplomacy. So you can pause and read those things as well. More definitions. When you look at the last half of the topic being internal armed conflicts in West Asia, there are 5 conflicts that meet the definitions that we previously discussed. So that it has to be violence involving armed confrontations, that it has to be between government forces and at least one non-government force, and that the conflict has to take place within the territory of the government forces state. So there are 5 different examples that come to mind that to me are topical. There are definitely other conflicts going on in West Asia, but I don't believe that they meet all 3 of these definitions. One example would be between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which would be considered an international armed conflict because it involves the forces of 2 different government states and non-government forces, whereas these are all primarily one government force and then at least one or more non-government forces. So that would be Yemen and the Houthi rebels, Israel and Palestine, Syria and lots of different groups within Syria, Turkiye and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and then between Iraq and ISIS, along with other ISIS-aligned groups. So now that we've gone over definitions and we know what is included in the topic, we need to give context for those different groups. So there's going to be 5 parts to this background, and it's not going to give any of these situations justice. You cannot learn enough about each of these unique situations involving decades-long conflicts with hundreds of thousands or even millions of people involved from a short debate topic lecture from some random debate coach in the United States. You have to do more research, more reading on your own in each of these situations. Even if all you do is watch a YouTube video that gives a timeline of the conflict, or read a couple of articles that give timelines of the conflict, that is going to be essential for any of the arguments on this topic to make sense, and for you to be able to explain them to any judge who's not well versed on the topic. So to delve into the background, first, when we look at the situation going on in Yemen, Yemen is a country in West Asia, and there is a civil war going on there between the government of Yemen and a group known as the Houthi rebels. The conflict largely began in January of 2011, and the Houthis are a group of Shiite Muslims in Yemen who protested because they wanted the former president to resign. And at first, the protests were peaceful, but then they started to become violent after they were brutally attacked, and then they started fighting back. And then it just escalated from there, with the Houthi rebels taking over large amounts of territory in the region. And over 11 years, things have only gotten worse. So far, 150,000 people have died since before 2020. There was a ceasefire that happened earlier this year that went from April 1st to October 3rd, but they failed to extend it. And another player that is heavily involved is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has largely been helping Yemen and funding Yemen's side of the conflict, and lots of other countries have been funding the Houthi side. So it's what's known as a proxy war, where there are people who are not technically in the conflict who are fighting each other by funding the sides that are actually fighting each other. The second part that you should have some background knowledge on is what's going on between Israel and Palestine. Again, you could do a whole semester-long course just on understanding what's going on between these two groups of people. But after centuries of long conflict between Jewish people and Arab people in the land that is called Israel, Both groups of people claim the land as their own, and both of them want the city of Jerusalem, which is considered the capital of Israel, to be their own city. Back in 1947, the United Nations tried to create a deal to separate the land into two states, but they failed to do so, and Palestinians have largely been forced to leave their homes to flee where they used to live into one of two areas in Israel that is considered Palestine or Palestinian territory, that being the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And because Donald Trump, when he was president, moved Israel's embassy to Jerusalem, making Jerusalem the capital of Israel in a lot of places' eyes, that upset Palestinians a lot because it was seen as choosing a side directly in the conflict. So things have just been getting more and more tense between the two groups of people occupying the same land. Then we have Syria, which you've probably heard about the Syrian Civil War and all of the refugees that have had to flee Syria because of it. The conflict is going on between Syria and lots of different groups, including the Syrian National Army, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, and ISIS. There were a bunch of pro-democracy protests in 2011, which is when a lot of these conflicts got started, and the pro-democracy protests got cracked down by the leader of Syria. And then the protests were so bad that people protesting were joined by people in the military who were tired of having to crack down on all of these people to create an opposition. And then that led to a civil war within 2 years. The civil war is still ongoing with all of these different groups. And since then, over 12 million people have died, over 12 million people have been displaced or forced to either flee their homes or go somewhere else within the country that they weren't from, and over 500,000 people have died. Fourth thing you should know background about is what's going on in Turkiye, the country formerly known as Turkey, and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. So Kurdistan was a region that had millions of people living in it, that was part of the Ottoman Empire that didn't really have its own country. And since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Kurdistan was basically split up between all of these different countries in the region. So there are Kurdish people living in at least 6 different countries in West Asia. And so they are a ethnic group and religious group of people. However, they're split between all of these different places, with none of them having land of their own that is theirs, where they have a lot of political power and freedom and human rights. So the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, was formed by Kurds to fight and protest for their own territory and their own rights. However, they have resorted to acts of what is called by many as terrorism against these different countries, particularly in Turkey, and it is designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the U.S., and the European Union. The ceasefire that was brokered between Turkey and the Kurds ended in 2015, and now Turkey is fighting the Kurds in both its own territory and in Syria, and the fighting is only getting worse. Fifth and finally, for background, we have Iraq, and they are currently still fighting what is left of ISIS, as well as having conflict with the Kurdish Peshmerga, where the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which, if you didn't know what ISIS stands for, that's what it stood for, was an offshoot of Al Qaeda that reemerged in 2011, took over large amounts of territory in both countries, and then the United States and a bunch of other countries invaded and helped Iraq fight ISIS, where ISIS has lost 95% of its territory by the end of 2017, when Iraq declared it as defeated. However, the group now exists just in smaller groups, and it doesn't have like a unified territory. So it is still fighting, still recruiting people, and there's all these opposition groups that are aligning with ISIS in Iraq to create instability in the region. Turkey is also involved in Iraq in skirmishes with the Kurdish Peshmerga, which is creating conflict, and there's still a lot of problems going on in the region. So now that we've gone over a lot of background and a lot of definitions for the topic, what is the main thing that we are actually debating here? And the question is, would more talks and negotiations orchestrated by the United States between warring parties in West Asia resolve or exacerbate the conflicts? If it would make the conflicts actually end and help create peace in the region, then you should probably vote pro. And if it would make the conflicts worse or cause problems that didn't make the benefits of resolving the conflicts worth it, then you should probably vote con. Fifth and finally, what is at stake? Who cares based on our decision to increase or not increase these diplomatic efforts? The primary stakeholders are going to be citizens in West Asian countries, particularly those affected by the internal armed conflicts. However, the government and organizational leaders and political figures in the conflicts themselves also have a lot to gain or lose. And then lastly is our involvement probably affects US citizens and business people, although they probably have the least to gain or lose despite the fact that it's US action being taken. So now that we have talked about the topic itself, analyzing it in all of those different ways, how are you going to argue this resolution? So to me, the pro arguments can be grouped into three different categories. I have 10 arguments that you could turn into contentions, but they fall into one of these three camps, and that is benefits of resolving specific conflicts, which I think is kind of like the plan way of debating this topic. And then there's more generic arguments that don't specify like one country in particular, and those would be the curbing influence arguments or minimizing the harms of conflict arguments. So, the first argument that the pro could talk about is about how increasing diplomatic efforts would help resolve the situation between Yemen and the Houthis. So, uniqueness, civil war in Yemen is in a fragile state. The ceasefire wasn't extended, but the conflict isn't as bad as it once was, which means that there's still time to fix things. So, how does voting pro make this better? The link is that increased diplomatic efforts by the United States federal government could help negotiate and end the conflict between the Houthis and the Yemen government, and ending the war saves lives. There are lots of different reasons why negotiations might help, specifically from the United States. You're just going to have to get those from your research. Second is about the Syrian Civil War. Again, uniqueness, the conflict is getting worse. It's not just between Syria and ISIS anymore. There's all these different splinter groups that are also fighting, and there are refugees that are fleeing the country by the millions. But increased diplomatic efforts by the United States federal government could bring all of these groups of people together, get their interests represented in the government, decrease the reasoning behind why people are joining opposition groups and avoiding the political process, which would help end the conflict. Ending the conflict will save not just hundreds of thousands of lives, but also help solve the refugee crisis that is rocking the world. Third pro argument area deals with Israel and Palestine. So, violence in the region between Israel and Palestine is getting worse, but diplomatic efforts by the United States federal government can support the creation of a two-state solution to end the conflict, which is probably the only way that it ever stops being violent, is if Israel is split up into two different countries, or even if the region has disconnected parts of it where it's treated as two different countries or two different states. And the impact, if we end the war between Israel and Palestine or the conflict, it will save lives and also preserve religious freedom. Fourth argument for the pro is about Turkey and the Kurdish population. So, uniqueness, Erdogan, who is the president of Turkey, has been, even in the last couple of weeks, very much trying to garner support and build the capacity to invade Kurdish groups in Syria, in Iraq, and in Turkey itself. And only by increasing diplomatic efforts from the United States federal government can we prevent an invasion or more violence from happening and encourage the adoption of ceasefires. Preventing an invasion, curbing the conflicts will help save lives and also reduce human rights abuses against the Kurdish people. Fifth, we have Iraq and democracy. Right now, Iraq is failing to incorporate different views and concerns of groups in the region, which is causing armed confrontations. The only reason why ISIS is still recruiting people is because they are playing upon the dissatisfaction of the population that believes that Iraq's government is not effectively letting their voices be heard, so they have to resort to violent means. But increasing diplomatic efforts will help improve governance and elections in Iraq and discourage people from joining opposition groups like ISIS. The impact being that democracy efforts will improve human rights and improving representation in the government, decreasing the number of people joining terrorist groups will save lives. So now we're entering into, instead of arguments about specific conflicts, it's more generic reasons why increased diplomatic efforts to end conflicts across the board would be beneficial. And the first argument that falls into that category is about China's influence. This is going to feel very familiar to people who've been debating the great power competition public forum topic. The uniqueness is saying that China is trying to build relations with and increase its presence in West Asia. They're trying to get more and more involved. But increasing diplomatic efforts by the United States will improve governance in different countries and prevent countries from turning to China, where China will not fill in the gap left by us leaving the region. And by preventing China's expansion in the region and their influence, we can protect our own economy and also prevent human rights abuses that China usually doesn't have a problem with when they increase their diplomatic efforts with these nations. Seventh argument area is about Russia's influence, very similar to the China argument that Russia is trying to build relations and influence West Asian countries. But when the United States federal government increases its diplomatic efforts to end the conflicts, it prevents countries from being swayed and controlled by Russia. The impact is different from the China argument because Russia encourages authoritarianism, and also by gaining influence in the Middle East, it will improve its economy. And hurting Russia's economy is crucial to preventing it from exacerbating and winning the war against Ukraine. Eighth, very similar again to the China and Russia argument, only this one is about Iran. Iran is another country in the region that is trying to improve its previously bad relations with other West Asian nations. As the U.S. has kind of decreased its involvement in the region, Iran is trying to increase its involvement. But by increasing our diplomatic efforts, we can prevent Iran from gaining too much influence, which is important because many believe that Iran is the world's #1 funder of terrorist efforts, and also they're trying to build nuclear weapons. But by preventing Iran from being able to lose its dependence on some things from the United States by improving their relations with West Asian nations, we keep a leverage tool over Iran. We want to prevent them from expanding their influence too much. Ninth pro argument, this just goes into kind of the general benefits with no specific country in mind of improving diplomatic efforts, and that is terrorism. When we pull away from the West Asian region, we are opening the doors for the resurgence of terrorism because people will not perceive the United States as being there to stop it. But when we improve diplomatic efforts from the United States federal government, it will encourage our allies or countries within the region to improve their own counterterrorism efforts, because we can use different diplomatic bargaining chips to get them to come to the table as far as counterterrorism efforts. And the impact is that terrorism kills thousands of people, causes wars, and destroys human rights. 10th and finally, we have foreign aid. This argument may or may not be topical. It all depends on how good of a definition or how good of a card that acts like a definition you can find. That is that the conflicts in the region are getting way worse, and increasing diplomatic efforts could include or should include improving relations with the countries involved by the giving of foreign aid as a way to get people to come to the negotiating table. And also because foreign aid has been shown in some studies to help end conflicts, and foreign aid is good because it saves lives and encourages the end of conflicts. But that might not be topical because some people consider foreign aid to be separate from diplomacy. So now that we've talked about how the pro can try and prove the resolution true, let's talk about the con. Remember, I believe that the pro can prove that the resolution is true by proving that an example of it is true, which means either one, the con needs to be ready with its own counter examples for every region in West Asia experiencing a internal conflict, which might be difficult because you have to write way more contentions, you have to write way more blocks, and you have to hope that your second speaker so that you can adapt to what the pro says. Or you have to read more generic arguments that you can then apply to the specific situations going on that the pro will talk about. I think that the second strategy is going to be the path of least resistance. So I have 10 arguments that are more general that could be applied to most of the situations that the pro would talk about. The first 5 are about trade-offs of diplomacy, where if we increase diplomacy in West Asia, we are going to have to decrease either diplomacy or other efforts in other places, which is bad. And then the last 5 arguments are just reasons why diplomatic efforts itself is bad. First main argument, and I feel like this might be the most popular or the strongest, perhaps, con argument on the topic, and that is about trading off with diplomatic efforts and influence efforts in East Asia or just in the rest of Asia. So for uniqueness, the US has largely pulled out both diplomatically and militarily of the West Asian and Middle Eastern region. Our foreign policy interests are now mostly about trying to compete with China. Again, if you did the great power competition topic, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The link as to how voting for the resolution would make this worse or would cause a problem is that if we are increasing our diplomatic efforts in West Asia, then that will trade off with putting our eggs in baskets in other regions in Asia, which means that we won't be able to compete with China as effectively. And if we can't compete with China, that will allow them to overtake us economically and military, which is bad for a litany of reasons. Second major con argument area is very similar to the first, but it's about Russia and Ukraine. The idea is that Russia and Ukraine are nearing readiness to engage in peace talks. There's articles that came out earlier today and earlier this week that show a shifting tone from Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine's president was just hosted in the United States recently as well in a diplomatic summit. So the link is that if we increase diplomatic efforts in West Asia, that will prevent us from focusing on diplomatic efforts to end the war in Russia and Ukraine, because we just can't do everything all at once. And also, it would hurt diplomatic efforts because Russia has an interest in most of the internal armed conflicts in West Asia, and is usually on the other side that we tend to support, which means that improving or increasing our diplomatic efforts might upset Russia and prevent them from being willing to involve the United States in peace negotiation talks, which is really bad because if we can't end the war in Ukraine, we can't save lives and help the economy that has been devastated by the war. Third is again similar to the first two, although it's a bit more general and it feels like a policy debate disadvantage. And that is the State Department overstretch argument. And that is our Department of State, which is in charge of almost all of our diplomatic efforts, is already very underfunded, very understaffed, and very undertrained. The State Department is struggling and struggled a lot under the Trump administration. And while Biden has done some work to restore it, it was struggling even before then. So how does voting for the pro make this worse or cause a problem? Well, if we try to increase diplomatic efforts in West Asia with our State Department struggling as it is, we're going to spread the department too thin, and that will make efforts in West Asia and in other places both ineffective and harmful. We'll have untrained, unqualified negotiators in really high pressure and important situations, which will cause a bunch of problems. It will hurt our diplomatic efforts all over the world, not just in West Asia, and it will upset our allies who will be damaged by the lack of beneficial trade talks, or not trade talks, negotiations. Fourth argument area is about hurting international relations. This argument, I think, could be popular, but it will be specific in different forms. If you can tailor it to the pro's case, I think it will be very effective. And that is the idea that improving diplomatic efforts basically means trying not to choose sides as much and trying to encourage both sides of conflicts to come together, which could really hurt relations with certain countries involved. So right now, the United States is trying to improve our relationship with several countries that have interest in West Asian internal conflicts like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. But when we increase diplomatic efforts in West Asia, we are going to upset those allies that are engaged in those conflicts and make them feel abandoned or villainized. So, for example, in the Yemen conflict, we have largely been working with Saudi Arabia to increase arms sales and talks to try and get the Yemen government to just overpower and militarily defeat the Houthi rebels. So if we increase diplomatic efforts, then Saudi Arabia is going to feel like we are abandoning them, are no longer trying to help Yemen win the war itself, which will upset them. Same with Turkey. We're trying to improve our relations with Turkey, who's a member of NATO. But if we try to get them to negotiate more with the Kurds, then that will likely upset them. And same with Israel. Trump was a very pro-Israel president, and by changing that policy to be more two-state solution, that will likely upset Israel and our Israeli allies. And the impact is that relations with these three countries is absolutely crucial to our economy, as well as our overall influence over human rights and other policy objectives in the region. Fifth con argument area, I don't know if you're going to be able to prove this one. You'd have to get some really good evidence for it, but that is trading off with or decreasing arms sales. And that is the idea that we are selling arms in many of these different conflicts to the side that we are aligned with, or to people who are aligned with the side that we agree with, which is helping us build relations by helping the good guys defend themselves militarily. But if we increase our diplomatic efforts to try and do non-military solutions to problems rather than helping one side win the conflict, we're just trying to get the conflict to end, then that will transition our military away from arms transfers. However, if we stop selling as many weapons because we're not focused on that as our primary strategy, then that will give the rebel groups like the Houthis, the PKK, and ISIS an advantage, because without our weapons, the sides that those groups are fighting probably would have lost a long time ago. And that will make the wars worse. Where gains have been made, those gains will be lost, and it could end up prolonging the conflict. Now that we've talked about reasons why increasing diplomatic efforts in West Asia might trade off with other priorities, here are some reasons for the next 5 arguments just why increased diplomatic efforts are probably a bad idea in general. The first of which is prolonging conflicts. This argument pairs very well with the ultimate argument in the literature for the con on this topic is not offensive, and we want our cases to be offensive. Remember, an offensive argument is a reason why the topic is true or false, like proving your side true or proving their side wrong. Whereas a defensive argument is like, meh, their side isn't as true, or our side isn't as false as they're saying it is. And so a defensive argument is best saved for the rebuttal, because it's like blocking a shot in soccer. It's not actually scoring a goal. You can't expect to win the whole debate or base your whole debate off of a defensive argument. This argument pairs with the defensive argument where you say that our diplomatic efforts don't work. They don't stop the conflicts. They don't really help. In fact, they end up making it worse, where most of the conflicts are de-escalating since we pulled out of Afghanistan, since the United States has shifted its priorities to other places outside of West Asia. But when we increase diplomatic efforts in West Asia, we are going to embolden countries or make countries feel like they can get away with anything, and the United States will always come to their rescue or will always take their side. But ending the conflicts by just letting the region solve it for itself, which is what happens when the United States pulls out, would save lots of lives and improve the global economy. But US involvement will just make the conflicts last even longer. Seventh argument is about imperialism or Orientalism. This is a critical argument, but you wouldn't have to make it as a critical argument. The idea is that the United States right now is largely abandoning its former high levels of involvement in West Asia, and you will argue that that is good because U.S. diplomacy and action in the region is rooted in support of American imperialism and racism or xenophobia or prejudice against West Asian peoples and the Islamic faith or the Jewish faith. And so increasing diplomatic efforts is just another attempt at us to expand our influence and our control to stamp out people who are different than us, and that expanding United States involvement in the region in any way will cause endless military interventions like it has in the past and entrench racist ideologies against the people of West Asia. Eighth is tolerating human right abuses. This is a more of a moral or value-based argument, so it could work in front of a lot of judges pretty well. The idea is that by not focusing on diplomatic relations with all of the involved West Asian internal conflicts, we are mostly choosing a side, and in most cases, you would argue the morally correct side of these conflicts. However, by engaging in diplomatic efforts, we are going to be trying to bring all affected parties to the table and try and get everyone what they want and try to compromise. And you will argue that compromising with all of the groups that are involved in these internal conflicts is bad, because that means that we are negotiating with authoritarian governments, with terrorists, and with human rights abusers just for the sake of peace, which is bad, you will say, because it will be immoral and because it will hurt our global reputation and make us a less effective supporter of human rights and democracy worldwide if we're cool with negotiating with people who blatantly disregard what we hold near and dear. Ninth argument is anti-American sentiment. This is kind of like the con version of the terrorism generic argument for the pro, where you say by pulling out of the West Asian region diplomatically and militarily, which is what we're doing now, we are decreasing, or we are no longer adding fuel to the fire of people who hate America and want America out of their countries. But when we increase diplomatic efforts, that is very unpopular with citizens of these nations and allows leaders of terrorist organizations like ISIS to stir up anti-American sentiment and to increase recruiting. And when we have more recruitment and more attacks, and we see more terrorism, then that is going to harm the American people as well as harming people within West Asian countries. 10th and finally, we have energy shifts. This again feels like a policy debate disadvantage, and I don't know in front of a lay audience how convincing this would be. Because it's kind of like an impact turn to high gas prices, which most lay judges are not going to be willing to listen to an argument as to why high gas prices are good. But, anyways, the idea of the argument is that instability in West Asia, all of these conflicts are making fuel prices go up. And when fuel prices go up, people can't buy gas as much. And when people can't buy gas as much, not only is that better for climate change because there's just less fossil fuels being burned, but it also encourages us to shift away from fossil fuels and towards more renewable energy sources. But if we increase diplomatic efforts, that will stabilize the oil prices, which will disrupt our need to swap to renewable energy, which has been made stronger by the conflicts going on in West Asia. And then you say that renewable energy is crucial to help fight against climate change. So increased diplomatic efforts by lowering the price of fuel will hurt the fight against climate change. So now that we've talked about the arguments for both sides, my takeaway tips for anything in this video is number one, you need to do a lot of reading and a lot of watching to learn about these different regions. Figure out what's going on there, who are the parties involved, what are the interests at stake for both sides. The more specific knowledge you have just about the topic, the better off you're going to be in these debate rounds. The next thing I would say is con needs to be ready for anything because the pro might be very, very specific or might be very, very general. So if you are realizing that this is only a 1 month long topic and you know that the next topic is where most places' national qualifying tournaments are, and you want to focus your energy on that topic, spend most of your time preparing for the con because I think that is the more difficult side. If the pro can prove the entire topic is true by proving, because all they have to do is prove that we should increase diplomatic efforts. So if they can give an example that can't be refuted by the con of diplomatic efforts that should be increased, then that's a pretty low barrier for them to win the debate. So if you're going to try and do a little bit less prep on this topic to prepare more for the next one, spend most of your energy after you write a solid pro case on getting ready with your blocks for the con, because you'll need to be way more prepared for everything the pro has to say. Lastly, I understand that this topic option was probably better than the other one that we could have voted for, but if anybody who's on the topic committee is watching this video, maybe I'm wrong. I just feel like topics like this don't belong in public forum, not because I hate policy. Policy is my favorite type of debate, but because topics like this expose the weaknesses of public forum. Not being able to read plans, not being able to read counter plans, only having a month to debate and research the topic, and having such a short format. This topic is going to be an absolute mess in a lot of cases, but maybe it won't be if people will make arguments that go to the heart of the resolution and don't just run away from clash. With that, I hope that this was helpful for you, and let me know how the season turns out for you in the comments. Please like and subscribe and help get this video to more places, and I will see you next month for the February public forum topic.